Welcome to Rethinking Museum Governance, an Apollo magazine and Charles Russell Speechlys art law briefing video. I'm Thomas Marks on behalf of Apollo, and in this short film we'll be discussing the legal and ethical roles and responsibilities of museum boards and trustees in the UK, considering how they can best fulfil those in good faith, and whether the focus of museum governance is likely to change as the activities and values of museums continue to evolve.
I'm Tim Maxwell, and this is Rudy Capildeo, head of the art and luxury team at Charles Russell Speechlys. We're delighted to partner with Apollo on a 3-video series of talks encompassing museum governance, digital marketplace, and artists in the world.
Charles Russell Speechlys is an international law firm with offices in the UK, France, Switzerland, Luxembourg, the Middle East, and Hong Kong. Our art and luxury team is top tier. We love looking after our collectors, creators, and curators to protect the assets and objects that they love. We hope you enjoy the video.
Xavier, let me ask you, in practice as an acting director of a leading museum, how you feel the relationship between perhaps in your organisation and others at this time, how the relationship between the trustees and the executive of a museum ought to work, and perhaps how you feel it might not always work as well as it would ideally.
I think essentially you need their support for the big decisions you have to make, particularly in the last few years. We've had to navigate through these very difficult financial storms, and I think they're there to provide advice, support, and I think the relationship is that you can talk to them, you can report to them. Of course, you've got to let them know, be very transparent with the figures, how things are going, and allow them to digest the information and return with advice. And I think that is the constant relationship, constant communication, and that's something I really believe in, and which we have at the Wallace Collection at the moment.
So trust is very important to you. Trust, that feeling that I suppose the decisions are made jointly and corporately. Legally, the trustees are responsible for decision making in a charitable organisation.
Yeah, the trustees are ultimately responsible for everything that happens within the organisations. That's why trust is so important, and that there's a really good working relationship, particularly between the chair and the director and the CEO, to make sure that they have ongoing dialogue, to make sure that everything's reported up to the board, and to enable that healthy, constructive challenge of the executive team, and even the other way round if the board perhaps aren't doing something or looking out for something or setting the strategy in the way that they should.
On that point about strategy, I mean, how much is that a conversation, or how much is a strategy imposed on museum executive from its board?
It's as far as my experience goes, I do provide the vision for the museum in terms of strategy, and I work very closely with my senior management team and the heads of the departments to come up with a vision statement, a strategy, how we're going to go forwards. We did get help from Boston Consultancy Group to sort of formalize it and come up with the right kind of language and documents. And then we presented to trustees, and trustees had their say. They sort of maybe modeled certain areas and refined other areas. The budget side of things is definitely what they really care about. They do not want to see the Wallace make a loss as such. So that's where they really want to act as a safety net. And then they approve it, and it's up to us to deliver it within the timescale. So that's what we've done so far.
Well, this point about financial accountability is vital, because the trustees are liable for, or at least have the responsibility for ensuring that assets and resources are spent to fulfil the objects of any charity, whether an art one or otherwise. Charles, in your experience, this balance between, as someone who has both been at executive level and involved in governance, this balance between who is taking the decisions and how they're being implemented, I mean, what's a healthy outlook for that?
I think when you said, is it legitimate for trustees to impose a vision for the future, the word impose greats just because it needs to be collaborative. And I think the use of the word trust is correct in these circumstances, that you shouldn't say it's for the executive to do it and then it gets ratified by the trustees. You need, ideally, a good enough relationship to be able to construct it jointly, would be my view. I mean, having said that at the portrait gallery, the board was quite hands-off, the corresponding aspect of that was that they were very supportive about coming to lots of events and very encouraging in an informal way, because in a way the formal requirements were less. The informal relationship was probably stronger. And I met my chairman every Tuesday morning at 8:30, and he definitely felt himself, and I felt him to be in charge, so that chemistry between chairman, chief executive, and board, I think differs according to the circumstances, and that in the end it's a relationship of people as much as it's a legal and fiduciary relationship.
Do you think there are some institutions in this country where trustees don't really know what they're getting themselves in for, or rather don't necessarily take the responsibilities of trusteeship seriously enough? Is there ever still a sense that the trusteeship is a sort of honorary position?
I think that's gone. If anything, I think the change is in the other direction, where now trustees possibly are over-interventionist and feel that they have all the authority and that the staff of the institution are there in a way to service the board. I think it has to be a relationship of mutuality. And the days, I mean, it's true, when I started the portrait gallery, there was a sense it was a particular style of establishment institution. But they were conscientious. I liked them. And the fact that they didn't meet that often didn't mean to say that they weren't very committed.
And Sarah, on this point about commitment and understanding the responsibilities of being a board member, I mean, do you think that institutions would benefit from, and their boards in particular, a greater sense of training for trustees? I mean, it's this difficult point where we're asking people to volunteer their time, but they are volunteering for something which is actually a serious responsibility.
I think training is key, and even for those that have spent many, many years as trustees, because the world is always changing. Legislation's always changing. The ask on them is changing depending on the stage of life that particular museum's in, or what its new strategy is. And we run training for all charities, and I always find it a really interesting experience, and we always get really good feedback from the trustees and from the executive team. And I think the sessions that work best are actually when both groups of people are in the room, because of the training then leads to dialogue between them. And yes, I just think it's very beneficial to refresh, to have a step back, have a think about what is each party's role, how can they help each other, what are the things that are coming up that they might not be aware of, at least annually. Perhaps at the end of a board meeting, just to have a training session to talk about governance and to talk about what's new and what others are doing, and to make sure that the museum is being governed in the best possible way.
That includes asking difficult questions. I mean, do you appreciate that but do you appreciate at least Xavier, the necessity for trustees to ask difficult questions, if not the fact of the difficult questions?
There's, of course, being challenged is key to me. It's for a director to have lots of ideas. Sometimes they're crazy, sometimes they're practical. Sometimes I think it's very important to have that dialogue and to be told it might not work, or have you thought about this, and other ways. The training is really important. I think some trustees, are still very professionally involved. They've got great expertise, and that's something that we've seen a lot with trustee appointments. We're very specific. We go for a legal trustee, we go for a HR trustee, we go for a financial trustee. So they come with a lot of professional experience. And I think sometimes that thin line of being getting involved too much in the operative aspect of running a museum can be a challenge for my team, that sometimes you're being told what to do when actually it should be advice, it should be support. So I think that's something that at the moment I find quite interesting to be dealing with, and I think training, reminding trustees of what their role is very key. And the same goes for the executive team, to know to what extent they can also push up their ideas and decision making.
You mentioned trustees with specific types of expertise, but to come back to Sarah on that point, I suppose one of the things that is really incumbent on all trustees to do, and that perhaps insouciantly, without them even thinking about it, if they have particular expertise, there are possibilities of conflict of interest. That's fundamental to trusteeship, isn't it? Declaring and other trustees being able to challenge.
It is, and it's something that the Charity Commission in particular takes very, very seriously. There will always be conflicts on a board, and the right shape of a board will always have people from different professional backgrounds, so that you've always got somebody on the board who might not know the answer but knows when to flag an issue and when to take advice and when it needs more discussion. But so there will always be conflicts, but as long as they are dealt with appropriately, then that's fine, as long as they're appropriately managed, which in most cases should be always possible.
In terms of sort of, obviously we've covered to some degree the legal responsibilities of trustees, but there are broader rubrics now and advice for trustees, including the Charity Governance Code, which I think is independently written, and that was updated last year. And there are quite significant updates to it to include more forceful clause for integrity for trustees, and also an EDI clause, an equality, diversity and inclusion clause. And there's something very interesting though in the updated code for trustees, which is that it suggests that museum trustees should be responsible for living by the values of the institution that they are a trustee of. Do you think, does that sound to you appropriate?
I don't know, I'm a bit cautious about these attempts to define and describe behaviour, so that under the Labour government there was the 7 standards of public life, which are all good and sensible things to do with integrity and honesty. And occasionally I look at the members of the government and wonder whether they are subscribing altogether to the 7 standards of public life. And I think one of the problems is these things get brought in, new kind of ways of doing things, and then people forget about them. And that's where I think the culture boards are making sure that people are aware that there are expectations which can be transgressed is in some ways at least as important as writing them down and defining them and getting everybody to put their thumbprint on them.
So in fact, a more pragmatic way of living, not necessarily by values, but according to the fact that
I'm a bit cautious that the Charity Commission requiring everybody to act with integrity is necessarily going to have the result that it requires. And I think the more people talk about honesty and integrity, in a curious way, normal standards in public life are, I think, slightly declining.
At the Wallace collection, in terms of, I mean, one thing I noticed on your website is you've got quite clear publication of your governance code, of your mission, and I think increasingly of what might be considered the values in relation to the collection and accessibility for the public. How far is that something that trustees not only contribute to, but sort of try to perform in meetings and perhaps in terms of their attitude to the museum?
I mean, primarily it's caring for the collection, making sure it's safe and well looked after, and then researched. As you say, we're cataloguing parts of the collection. So there is active interest in that. I think what I've tried to bring to the table is doing more exhibitions as a way of showcasing certain works, and they've been very supportive of that. So that's another way of trying to make the collection accessible to the general public. That's one of our main sort of tenets, really, and for the trustees and for staff, is to make the collection accessible and make people learn from it. And they do place a lot of interest in that, particularly in our learning and our special programming activities. So the support is there, definitely, and the interest is there throughout.
Sarah, let me push back to this point about ethical values as opposed to legal responsibilities. In your work, is that something you're seeing more of, museums asking you, in fact, where the line is between the ethical and legal responsibilities of trustees?
It's always been a blend of the two. I mean, the legal responsibilities are clearly set out, but there's also everything else, and even the governance code is something that there's lots of lines, blurred lines around it, and for each institution there's a call about whether or not actually things that are set in stone in the code are actually right for that particular institution. So a lot of the advice that we would give is around that. So it's a blur between law, ethics, good governance, and just making sure that everything is thought about.
And what right does a board have to change the charitable objects of a museum, to alter the code of governance?
So you can change the governing document, and you can change the objects, but you would usually, depending on the organisation, how it's structured, need to get Charity Commission consent or even government consent, even a change of legislation in terms of, you know, some of the museums that have an Act of Parliament as their prime governing document. So it's not easy to change the objects, but it's certainly something that could happen if you need to, if they've become outdated or if they've been worded in a way that's just no longer appropriate. So yeah, it's possible.
Xavier, the Wallace collection, I don't think you changed the mission of the museum, but obviously in recent years you challenged the reception of, or the interpretation of, the bequest. How far was that a decision that needed to be taken and seen through between you and the board working together?
So yes, the Lady Wallace's bequest says that the collection shall remain together and unmixed with other objects. And for the last 119 years, it was regarded that nothing could leave or enter the collection, at least, temporarily and permanently. And with the trustees, we decided that actually that doesn't quite. You could legally say that actually it could be interpreted in a different way, that yes, permanently you can't break up the collection and permanently you can't bring other people's collections. So it's about the integrity of the Wallace collection, that it should remain together forever. But temporary loans should be possible because Richard and Lady Wallace were very generous lenders. So it was something that I presented to trustees. They took into account what this would mean, particularly with a business plan attached to the fact that if you do exhibitions, you can bring in more people, you can make your restaurant do better, the shop do better. So economically, it would make a lot of sense, particularly as our grant and aid has been declining since 1992. It was 90% in 92, and it's now just over 40%. So we do have to find ways of bringing the commercial side to and make it successful. So that was something we discussed at length with the trustees and staff. And then it was worked out how one would go about it. And as Sarah says, the Charities Commission was definitely the first port of call to see if that would be possible.
Charles, Xavier mentioned commercial operations and also funding. And I suppose trustees have been pulled further into fundraising, particularly in those institutions where central or even arm's length funding has decreased, whether in real terms or effectively, because trustees have had to have a far greater oversight over where the other money is going to come from.
I think they're all much more involved, expected to be much more involved in fundraising for exactly the reason you described, because the culture in the 1980s changed towards a more Americanized model whereby fundraising was expected to be part of what the institution did. And the trustees, I think, need to lead that, because in the end they are likely to have the financial contacts and friendships and alliances with people who
conflicts of interest.
Potentially. And that obviously is an issue which is coming up in America, I think more than here, where the boards of the Museum of Modern Art and the Whitney have been attacked, because in America the presumption is that 80% of the funding will come from the Board of Trustees, and that assumes that the trustees are fantastically well off, which has been the tradition in New York. But that produces a particular culture of governance, and it particularly means that they're very unrepresentative of the population at large. And so an attack on that is being led mainly, I think, by artists and by the realization that some of them have financial interests which are now regarded as unacceptable in relation to this issue of probity. So that hasn't, I think, quite come this side of the Atlantic, but in general, historically, things which happen the other side of the Atlantic cross over.
Well, there are two things I want to pick up there. One on the sources of funding and whether that means the wealth of the trustees themselves in relation to the museum, or the funds that they may help to raise. And Sarah, this is a live discussion, and I just wonder, talking myself to people involved in development, there's a lot of sense that perhaps in some cases museums haven't had a strident enough due diligence process to protect against reputational damage in terms of questions being asked about the source of their funding. What more, really, in a nutshell, should museums be doing to protect against that reputational damage that may come from questionable funds?
I mean, it's not just unique to the museum sector. I think all charities need to really look, if a donation is coming their way, where it's coming from. They must do their due diligence, and if anything feels a bit off about it, or if there's conditions attached to it that are just inappropriate, then they need to consider it in the round of, is this in the best interests of the charity, of the museum, to accept this funding on these terms, and not be afraid to push back if it is inappropriate, or if they're worried about the source of the funding. But the days of just accepting a nice cheque have long gone.
Well, I think there's a big problem looming, which is that in order to be successful at fundraising, you have to establish good relations with donors. And in my view, and to an extent from my experience, the changed moral climate, which is to be more anxious and to some extent suspicious of people who have made lots of money, is going to make fundraising more difficult. Just because if the first question is likely to be, and now has to be, where does money come from? What are the sources of their wealth? And are some of the sources of their wealth unacceptable? Actually, it will have an effect, I think, on the chemistry of the relationship with donors.
It's very hard to say in 2021 whether funding accepted in 2021 will be acceptable still in 2051, particularly if that is an endowment of some sort. So if the money hasn't been spent, is there any way that museums can protect against, can future-proof themselves against those sort of moral questions being asked of them in decades to come?
I think just as long as they go through the right processes in accepting donations, I think being close to your donors, the risk is going to be less. I'm more worried about donations that come from somewhere that you've somewhere unique, or somewhere that an avenue you've never explored before, or a particular benefactor you've never come across before as an organisation. There's always, we haven't got a crystal ball. We don't know what the appetite and what the feeling will be in the future. But as long as donations have been accepted and as being in the best interests of the charity, with all the necessary due diligence done and recorded and documented in the board minutes, as long as the directors can show that they've acted in the best interests of the charity on today's terms, then that will definitely protect anyone looking back at what happened in the future.
I suppose transparency within the organisation is key to that. I noticed looking at the National Portrait Gallery minutes, and perhaps this is similar at other institutions, that at least for the trustee board minutes from the whole of 2020, every single one has some information redacted in it, whether that's because of commercial interests or in at least one instance to protect personal data regarding attendance of a non-board member. Does that strike you as correct, Charles?
I fear it's partly a result of Freedom of Information Act, that once the Freedom of Information Act came in and boards were required to publish meetings, I think inevitably, not necessarily to their disadvantage, but meetings tend to be abbreviated and not to record the discussion but only the decisions. Now, in terms of transparency, that's a good thing, but in terms of the writing of history, at the Academy, I inherited a kind of Hansard view of minutes, which actually sometimes it was faintly preposterous, where people would rewrite what they had thought they should have said. And it took up a disproportionate amount of time and energy. I don't really recommend that. But in terms of a historical record, obviously you get the discussion and the differences of opinion and who thought what.
Well, do you think there are two versions of those minutes? And the trustee, the charity that I'm a trustee of, Art UK, produces very thorough minutes of its meetings, and it is that sense of reading back over the conversation, if not rewriting, at least having the sense before the minutes are signed off of being able to qualify any decisions that were made.
You may have struck the right balance, but I think getting that balance, I certainly notice that now where things are published online by institutions which are publicly funded, they go for brevity, for perfectly understandable reasons, that they don't want the press to be asking too many questions. I mean, freedom of information was about the rights of the citizen to know and understand how public institutions were run. But in practice, it's tended to be used mainly by the press in order to find things which they can use as levers against the organisation. And that's made people, paradoxically, it's possible that it's made institutions a bit more secretive because of this tendency for them to redact or say these things are confidential, and that is a tendency.
To move on, I want to talk about the makeup of boards and how representative they are. Do you feel that museum boards need to be more representative of the audiences of those museums? It's all very well to think we need a legal representative, a marketing expertise, a figure with marketing expertise, but should the actual visitors to the museum, the people who use its website, also be represented in its governance?
I think what I like to see is a board that shows diversity in terms of the collection, what we have, how we can engage with different communities, and maybe through our learning program, for our exhibitions, allowing members of the public to represent perhaps those parts of the collections to further our understanding of who we might be able to serve better.
In fact, that might help in terms of discussions, in terms of thinking about what the collection makes possible. So with the Islamic Arms and Armour, for instance, the meeting between an increase in racial diversity on the board might in fact change what you're doing and how you approach those objects, to have just a wider discussion.
No, completely. I mean, for example, you've mentioned the Islamic Arms and Armour. We have also a great collection of Sikh armour, and it would be fascinating to have somebody from that community represent that area, to allow us to sort of see it differently and understand what their communities might want to get out of the collection, rather than seeing it in a very Western way of displaying it with literally a label in a case. Are there ways of making that interaction much more interesting, accessible for communities that perhaps we are completely ignoring at this very moment?
And Sarah, do you think this move towards perhaps a more participatory model, where more of the where the beneficiaries of the charity are somehow better represented on the board of the charity. Is that the direction of travel?
It's certainly the direction of travel, and I think it's important for the board to be as diverse and representative as many different people as possible. And I think it's quite limiting if a board is made up of similar people with who've come from the same kind of backgrounds, same kind of education, the same life experiences. Saying that, I think our system is actually perpetuates this problem, because if we don't, coming back again to the fact we don't pay our trustees, means that really only, generally older people who have had successful careers and now have the time to be able to give back on boards. So that means that's kind of slants towards people being older on boards. Likewise, probably still too many white men on boards of charities. I think things are definitely changing, and it's something that trustees are telling me it's something that they're focusing on. We're updating a lot of governing documents to try and make this completely baked into the governance of the organisation, but I think it's something that's perhaps happening slower than it needs to.
So this is a challenge that, in a sense, many boards are still constituted largely by individuals who reflect perhaps an old sense of authority, or they've achieved authority in their...
It's for the reason Sarah describes, that there's a tendency to recruit people who have had careers who are now giving back and able to give the time. Often being a board member, especially being chairman, I've discovered being chairman of the Royal Drawing School takes up a great deal of time and energy. And so that recruiting younger people in those circumstances isn't straightforward. I think it is necessary. We've made efforts to do that in the Royal Drawing School, I think greatly to its benefit, for exactly the reason you described, that you get different perspectives and not this sense of being a homogenous group of people of the same background and type.
But we have got, it seems, a crux here, which is that in order to be a trustee in a museum in this country or an arts organisation, you probably need if to do it properly, you need a lot of time, and you need to give that time for free. However, a lot of boards are constituted by people who, in some cases, obviously, wisdom of age and all that, but in some cases may not have the expertise to advise on some of the things that are floating across the board's in tray. For instance, on questions of advising on digital strategies or on EDI, perhaps. Not that all people who are retired don't have a view on that, but that sense that we have a problem perhaps with the system where, let me ask it to you directly, Sarah. Do you think trustees should be paid?
I think perhaps that would be something that would transform the governance of organisations. I think there are some concerns about that because of the conflicts, as we discussed before. So perhaps moving to a system where some of them are paid and preserve the voluntary status for some others. At the moment, for most organisations, particularly those that are regulated by the Charity Commission, it is possible to pay trustees, not for being trustees, but for particular services they might provide. So, for example, if one's an accountant or a lawyer, their firm might be able to provide them.
That to me feels like conflict of interest. I think if you have a legal trustee who is then simultaneously supplying services from their firm, that to me would be a kind of red area.
Well, perhaps we need work on the other end, more employers to actively give time and say, you should be encouraged to join charitable boards. We will give you that time. You don't have to take it as leave. That is part of working for us, that we want you to also do things, not pro bono on behalf of the company, but somehow at arm's length from the employer.
Which many legal firms do, don't they?
Yeah, they do. And not just legal firms as well, but all kinds of businesses are trying to demonstrate that they are social, responsible businesses, and this is one of the things that a lot of businesses are doing. But I think it comes down to, especially if you're chair of an organisation, as Charles said, it's a job in itself. It's a massive job in itself. So somebody who is a busy professional, even with time allowed off to be a trustee, it still might not be enough.
Well, on that note, I'm going to draw this discussion to a close. So thank you very much to Xavier Bray, to Sarah Rowley, and to Charles Saumarez Smith. Thank you for watching this Apollo and Charles Russell Speechlys Art Law briefing